Hi guys, welcome back to another video. In this video I'm going to be talking through the whole process of how I drew this fox in graphite. This video is slightly longer than usual as I didn't want to cut out loads of footage, especially if there is someone trying to follow along. To make this drawing really simple, I kept my tools fairly limited and only used 2 pencils. So to begin with, I'm using a 10B Pitt Graphite matte pencil, but throughout this video I will also be using a 2B Castell 9000 pencil, a Mono Zero eraser, a blending stump, an embossing tool, and the paper I'm using is Strathmore's Bristol Smooth Surface 400 series. They also have a 300 series which is slightly cheaper, and in all honesty I can't tell the difference. There is also a 500 series that is quite a bit more expensive, but I am yet to try it out, so I may have to try it out in a future video. All of these supplies will be listed in the description of this video. So with these 2 pencils I'm using, generally speaking I will be using the 2B pencil for the lighter areas and the 10B pencil for the darker areas like this nose. The 2B pencil has a harder lead and will sharpen to a thin point, which will make it easy to get them thin, sharp details. The 10B Pitt Graphite matte pencil is going to make it a lot easier to get them really dark values. It also reduces the reflectiveness of the graphite so them dark areas can actually appear dark. So the reference photo I'm using for this drawing is an image from Unsplash, which will also be linked in the description. I have flipped the image and also made it grayscale, which will make it a lot easier to match values. I always print out my reference as it makes things easier when your reference is the same scale as your drawing. I can't stress enough how important a reference is when drawing realism. Now with all that stuff out of the way, let's actually get into the drawing. So as you can see, I am starting with the nose as it's the leftmost part of the fox, and I am right-handed, so to reduce smudging I will be working from left to right. I also like to map out the darker areas and then go back in to fill the light areas, which generally have more detail in them. So with the nose filled in, I am now working my way out and adding the fur. When drawing fur, there are 3 main things to think about: the length, the direction, and the overall tonal value. So around this nose the fur is very short, so I'm keeping my pencil marks short and also making sure that I have a sharp pencil so that the marks I'm making are nice and thin. For the immediate area around this nose, the fur is fairly dark, so I'm keeping my marks close together. However, as we move into the lighter areas of the fur, I'm going to space out my marks slightly. I am now switching to the 2B pencil for the lighter areas, which is also going to make it a lot easier to add these tiny hairs as it has a much harder lead and can keep a sharp point. So apart from the different pencils and the spacing between the marks, there is also one more way to control the tonal value, and that is pressure. This is arguably the most important as it is definitely the most used method. So the harder you press with the pencil, the darker it will get. This pressure control comes with practice, but it is always good to start with a lighter pressure than you think, as it is a lot easier to layer and build up value over time. Now here I am using that sharp 2B pencil to add a few hairs coming out from the fox, and with a fast flicking motion I am able to tape the ends, which make the hairs look a lot more natural. I am also varying the direction ever so slightly and adding a curve, trying to match the reference. As I make my way further to the right, I am now mapping out the slightly darker marks on the fox's muzzle where the whiskers protrude. Although I have a light sketch, it is sometimes easier to add some extra points of reference like these markings so that you are less likely to get lost with the reference. But before going too far with these markings, I go back and fill in the gaps, trying to render these areas the best I can. Throughout this process, I am constantly looking at my reference and trying to match the length, direction, and the value of the fur. These 3 things will constantly be changing throughout the drawing, so it is really important that you are looking at your reference. A lot of the time I will even be looking at my reference while drawing, and just glancing back at my drawing from time to time. Blind drawing comes with practice, but if you ever wonder why them art teachers made you do them pointless blind drawings, this is why. Here I am going back to certain areas trying to build up the value some more. You won't always get the value right the first time, but as you get further and further into the drawing, it will become easier as you have more of your drawing as a reference. Once I'm happy with that area, I skip ahead again and map in any of those darker, more prominent markings that I can then use as reference points. Now I'm moving on to the mouth area and start with outlining the teeth, which weren't very clear in my sketch. That's where I grab my reference so I can make sure that I am placing everything in the correct position. The top area of this lower drawer is very dark, so I'm using my 10B pencil and pressing fairly hard whilst I make my way around these teeth. As I render this area, I also use the Mono Zero eraser to pull out some lighter areas where I went a bit too dark. This eraser can be used to also add some fur texture, however you won't be able to pull out very thin lines with this, even though it is a small detail eraser. With this mouth area, you can see that the top drawer has some fur that hangs down over the dark area, so here I'm using short flicking motions with my 10B pencil to add that dark area, but also leave the fur texture on top. Now we're back with some better lighting. I think I must have forgotten to turn my light on in the last clip. But as more of this muzzle is rendered, you can see that I'm leaving the very top area untouched, as this is the lightest area in the reference, so I want to keep that area the white of the paper. The reference also has a background that contrasts these light areas, however I opted to keep the background completely white, so I had to alter things slightly. On the very edge of the highlighted areas, I create separation from the background by adding some light fur texture that then blends into the highlighted area. I did have to go back and adjust some of the values a few times so that the highlighted areas looked like more of a highlight, but like I said, as more of the drawing gets completed, you will find it easier to get the values correct. I also always take some time at the very end to go back and adjust any areas that don't quite match my reference. As you can see here, I'm using a very light pressure and also using the edge of the pencil with my hand held further back to blend the darker areas into the highlight. By using the edge of the pencil, you're able to create slightly blurred look, which in this case matched the reference. With this area here, I do use an embossing technique to add some of them light but defined hairs. I will talk about this technique more in a bit, where you're able to see it a little bit more clearly. But with these lighter areas of fur, I'm using the 2B pencil and making marks that differ in direction, and are now also getting slightly longer than around the nose area. If you look at the reference with this area, you can see that the individual hairs aren't straight nor going in the same direction. So if you add some randomness with these marks, you'll be able to create a more natural look to the fur. Now here you can see that I'm using a blending stump to soften some of the marks. A lot of the time there isn't many harsh or super sharp details, so by using a blending stump you're able to blend out and create more natural transitions. A lot of the time I will also go in with an eraser afterwards, as the blending stump will likely darken some of them highlights. So with my Mono Zero eraser, I'm going back in and using that fast flicking motion to pull out some highlights and also add a slight texture. And now we are finally moving onto the eye. I sometimes like to start a drawing with the eye, but since this eye was closed and I wanted a white background with minimal smudging, it made more sense to work left to right. So to begin with, I'm just trying to map out the darkest portion of this eye. I'm using quite a lot of pressure here as this is one of the darkest areas in the reference. And as we speed through this, you can see that I'm starting to add some of that fur texture around the eye. Now in particular with the lower eyelid, you can see that there's an area with no hairs. So I'm making sure that I'm following my reference so that I'm only adding fur texture where it needs to go. There are also some whiskers above the eye, but I'm leaving all the whiskers out until the very end. As we move further along with this piece, there are now some areas where the fur is clumping together slightly. So instead of adding lots of small little hairs, I am using larger marks and following the dark areas that I can see on my reference to make the fur look like it's clumping together. It can sometimes be hard to get the hang of a different texture, so if there is a texture that you think you might struggle to create, you can always practice on a spare bit of paper first. I am now working my way up towards the ears where things start to get a bit more blurry, so I'm holding the pencil further back and using more of the edge of the lead to create a softer blurred look. To transition into this softer fur, I'm using a very light pressure and using the tip of the pencil for the areas with more defined hairs. And now for this further back here, there isn't much texture going on, so I start with filling it in with a base layer of graphite using circular motions to try and reduce any texture. I start lighter than I need as I then go in with a blending stump which can darken the graphite slightly. But before I go too far, I use the embossing technique again to add some of them white hairs that are in front of that ear. After I have filled in and blended that area, I go back in with the pencil to darken the areas that need to be darker. I then swap between the blending stump, pencil and eraser until I am happy. I am now going to speed through a lot of this drawing until we get onto something that I think we should talk about, as a lot of this process is now just repeating what we have already done up until this point. And since this is a tutorial video, I don't want to cut large sections out. So, the embossing technique. I've used it a couple times already, but this is one of the areas that it shows up quite well. So in any areas where there are light hairs on top of dark areas, this technique works really well. So I'm using an embossing tool which has a small ball on the end, and I'm pressing it into the paper to indent the paper where I want the hairs. So when I go over them embossed areas with graphite, the graphite will skip them areas and leave them white. If you don't want the hairs to be completely white, you can tone the area first with graphite and then emboss so that your hairs are toned with graphite. Here you can see I'm slowly making my way over these embossed areas with my 10B pencil, and the lighter hairs are starting to appear. Without this technique, it would be very hard to get the dark value in between all of those small hairs. I'm not sure how well other papers will emboss, so if you are using a different paper to this one, you could test on a spare piece of paper first. I would think most papers would be okay as long as they have some thickness to them. Now, as I move down into some of this thicker fur, there are some large areas of shadow that lie in between the clumps of fur. So before doing anything, I use the embossing technique again to add any of the hairs that overlap these dark patches. Then I went in and filled the dark areas with my 10B pencil. These dark areas blend into the lighter fur, so I'm using that flicking motion again, but this time with longer strokes, as the hair in this section is much longer. I am also making sure to control the pressure as the dark areas transition to a lighter value. In this area I used the embossing technique, however I didn't tone the paper enough so the embossed hairs appear too light. So to fix this, I take my 2B pencil with a sharp point and I am able to get the pencil into the embossed areas and darken them slightly. Now when I think I've come to a finish, I usually like to sleep on it and come back the next day to make any last adjustments. Sometimes it can help to stand back or squint slightly to see if the values are the same as your reference. And once I'm happy, I clean up the background with an eraser to remove any smudges, which are inevitable. And then I almost forgot, we need to add the whiskers. So I take my 10B pencil and slowly draw in the whiskers, trying to taper out the ends so that they look natural. I follow the reference as some are more straight and some are more curved, and they are all different lengths. If you have enjoyed this video, please leave a like or subscribe if you haven't already, and thank you for making it to the end of this video.